They thought they were clever. They thought nobody would notice. The two HOA Karen sisters, always poking their noses into everyone's business, finally found a way to steal from me without asking. One afternoon while I was away, they dragged a heavy extension cord across the grass and plugged straight into the outlet on the side of my house. To them it was free electricity, hidden, harmless. They set up their bouncy castle for some HOA event, the fans humming as it swallowed power from my home. They laughed, sipping wine on their porch, thinking I would never catch on. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that outlet wasn't wired like a normal one. It was a forgotten line, left by the previous owner, that ran straight through the septic system's pump. Every spark of power they stole was feeding into the one place no one would ever want to touch. The tank buried deep in my yard, and as their party grew louder, kids bouncing and parents clapping, a strange gurgle began to echo under the grass, a sound nobody paid attention to. Not until it was too late. The sisters had no clue their little theft was about to trigger something unthinkable. The ground trembled, the pipes groaned, and the outlet they thought was their secret lifeline was about to betray them in the most disgusting, unforgettable way possible. They wanted free power. They got raw sewage. The neighborhood had a rhythm of its own, and for as long as I had lived there, it was the HOA sisters who tried to keep that rhythm under their control. People called them the Karens behind their backs sometimes, even to their faces, because they carried themselves like self-appointed queens. Their real names didn't matter anymore. What mattered was their constant obsession with rules, fines, and authority. If you left your trash bin out too long, they were the first to send a complaint. If your lawn wasn't cut at precisely the right length, they issued warnings. If your Christmas lights stayed up until January 2nd, they would threaten a fine. But for all the rules they shoved down everyone else's throats, they lived by none themselves. That was their specialty: control without consequence. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when I noticed the cord for the first time. A thick orange extension cable stretched across my side yard, neatly tucked against the fence like someone hoped I wouldn't see it. It snaked straight to the outlet on the side of my house, the one I almost never used. At first I thought maybe a contractor left it there by mistake, but then I traced it with my eyes over the fence. There they were, the Karen sisters, sitting on their deck with smug smiles and glasses of white wine. Beyond them, a massive inflatable bouncy castle groaned and swayed as children leaped inside. The worry fans keeping it alive were plugged directly into my electricity. I froze for a moment, staring. Part of me wanted to march right over, pull the cord out, and shove it back over their fence. But another part of me, a quieter, more patient side, decided against it. Something told me this wasn't the kind of thing I should rush. I leaned against the fence, pretending to inspect my shrubs, and listened. This was such a good idea, one sister said, her voice sharp and nasal. Of course it was, the other replied. Why should we pay for power when it's right there? He barely even lives in that side of the yard, he'll never notice. I bit my tongue so hard I nearly laughed. They thought they were clever, invisible, above being caught. I didn't shout, didn't confront, didn't even blink. Instead I took it all in their arrogance, their laziness, their certainty that the world owed them everything. What they didn't know was that my house had a secret when I first moved in. The inspector explained something odd about that outlet. It's connected to the septic pump, he had said, frowning as he traced the wires. Previous owners must have rerouted it years ago. It still works as an outlet, but most of the power cycles into the tank system underground. Don't rely on it for anything heavy. At the time, I barely thought about it. I didn't plan on using that outlet anyway. But now, watching the sisters suck down stolen energy from it, the irony hit me so hard I nearly grinned. Every second they stole power, they were also putting strain on the septic pump. And anyone who has lived with a septic system knows what happens when it gets overworked. Pressure builds, tanks bubble, valves spit, and eventually something very nasty finds its way back to the surface. I didn't warn them. Instead, I sat back on my porch that evening and pretended to mind my own business. The kids jumped higher, the sisters laughed louder, and that orange cord hummed with energy that didn't belong to them. By nightfall, the bouncy castle deflated, and they dragged the cord back over the fence without so much as a glance toward my house. The next day, they did it again. Another party, another plug-in, another theft. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. By the weekend it had become routine. They plugged into my outlet as casually as if it were their own. The arrogance dripped from every move they made. Neighbors walked by, shaking their heads, but nobody dared to say anything. Everyone had felt the sisters' wrath before, and no one wanted to be their next target but me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even frustrated. I was patient. I knew what was coming. On Saturday afternoon, the sisters threw their biggest event yet. Cars lined the street, music pulsed through their speakers, and guests crowded into their yard. I saw balloons tied to the fence, long tables covered with food, and kids running wild between folding chairs. And, of course, there was that bright orange cord, plugged firmly into my septic-powered outlet. I leaned against the porch railing, watching, waiting. Isn't this perfect? one of the sisters said, her voice floating over the fence. Everything looks amazing and it's not costing us a penny. The other one cackled. He probably doesn't even know we're plugged in, and if he does, what's he going to do? He's too quiet to ever say anything. I nearly laughed out loud at that. Too quiet maybe, but silence doesn't mean ignorance. Silence can be strategy. As the evening stretched on, the music grew louder, the lights brighter, and every hum of that cord sent more strain into the septic pump. I could almost hear it below the ground, groaning with the pressure, gasping to keep up. The thought alone made my heart race. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I noticed the first sign, a faint muffled gurgle under the grass near the fence line. Nobody else heard it. Nobody else noticed, but I did. And I knew exactly what it meant. The Karens thought they were stealing electricity, but what they had actually done was awaken something foul beneath the ground. I sat back, folded my arms, and let the night unfold. The following day began quietly. A heavy stillness lingered over the neighborhood, the kind that feels almost suspicious after a night of noise and chaos. Birds hopped along the fence, chirping as if nothing unusual had happened. The sisters' yard, however, told a different story. Empty cups and half-deflated balloons were scattered across their lawn. The bouncy castle sagged on its side like a tired beast, its fan still humming faintly, still plugged into my outlet. I leaned out with my coffee mug in hand, watching as the sisters shuffled outside in their robes, picking up trash half-heartedly. One of them muttered, "We'll just keep it running until we pack it up. Saves us the hassle." The other nodded, yawning, "And why not? It's free. I mean, what's he going to do? Complain, please." They laughed at their own arrogance, completely unaware of the ticking clock they'd wound beneath their own feet. I sipped my coffee, hiding the smirk tugging at my lips. By mid-morning, the air began to change. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a faint sourness, like something damp and unpleasant hiding in the breeze. I knew that smell. Anyone with a septic system knew it. It was a scent of pressure, of gas creeping through the soil, the system begging for relief. But the sisters didn't notice, or maybe they did, but chose to ignore it. They were too busy dragging out another set of tables for yet another casual neighborhood gathering. This time it wasn't kids and balloons, but wine bottles, cheese boards, and folding chairs. For the adults, they called it community bonding, but really it was just another excuse to show off their self-appointed power. Guests began arriving, parking along the street, waving politely as they walked past my house. I returned their nods, pretending nothing was wrong, though I could already sense the tension building underground. The septic pump groaned faintly each time the bouncy castle jerked and swayed, like an old man wheezing with effort. By early afternoon, the smell had grown stronger, not overwhelming yet, but noticeable enough to wrinkle a nose if the wind blew the wrong way. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sniffing the air. "Do you smell that?" one woman whispered to her friend. "Probably the creek," the friend replied, fanning her face dismissively. The sisters overheard but brushed it off with their usual smugness. "This is a beautiful neighborhood," one said loudly. "We don't have smells like that here. People are just sensitive." I chuckled under my breath. Denial was their strongest weapon, but it wasn't going to save them this time. The hours ticked by, and with each passing minute, the septic system strained harder. That faint gurgle I'd heard the night before returned, louder now, echoing beneath the ground near the fence line. If you stood close enough, you could feel the earth tremble faintly, like something shifting just beneath the surface. I wandered out to water my plants, pretending to mind my own business. A couple of the guests glanced at me, then quickly looked away, as though they didn't want to acknowledge my presence. After all, siding with the sisters was easier than being on their bad side. "Afternoon," I said casually, spraying the hose over my flowers. "Afternoon," one man muttered back, before quickly joining the others around the table. Meanwhile, the sisters raised their glasses high, toasting to another successful community event. Their laughter carried over the fence, shrill and grating, completely oblivious to the danger bubbling under their feet. By late afternoon, the smell became impossible to ignore. It clung to the air, heavy and sour, creeping into every corner of their yard. Guests began shifting uncomfortably, whispering to each other. A few fanned themselves. Some covered their noses with napkins. "Seriously, what is that?" a man asked, wrinkling his nose. One of the sisters waved her hand dismissively. "It's nothing. Probably fertilizer from one of the neighbors' lawns." "Doesn't smell like fertilizer," another guest muttered. I could hardly contain myself. I leaned casually against my porch railing, sipping another coffee, watching the scene unfold like a stage play. The Karens were losing control, but they didn't know it yet. Then came the sound, low, guttural rumble that rose from the ground like a growl. It wasn't loud enough to stop the party, but it was enough to silence a conversation or two. People tilted their heads, confused, trying to place it. "What was that?" someone asked. "Probably construction down the road." One sister replied quickly, her voice tinged with forced cheer, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The ground near the bouncy castle shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like the earth had exhaled. A few kids jumped harder, laughing as the castle swayed unnaturally. Their parents called out nervously, telling them to be careful. The sisters poured more wine, desperate to keep the mood alive by evening. The smell had reached its peak. Guests openly complained now, covering their noses, glancing toward the ground. One couple whispered to each other and quietly slipped out the gate, heading for their car. Another family followed, shaking their heads as they left. The sisters tried to keep smiling, but cracks had formed in their perfect facade. Their eyes darted nervously to the ground whenever that gurgle rose up again, louder each time. I leaned on my fence, enjoying every second. It wasn't my doing. It wasn't my fault. All I had done was nothing. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. Their own greed, their own arrogance, had led them here. The septic system wasn't mine anymore, it was theirs. Every stolen volt of power had tied them to it, and now it was ready to collect. As dusk settled, the party thinned out. Only a handful of loyal guests remained, sipping wine with forced smiles as the smell gnawed at their throats. The sisters laughed louder than ever, their voices sharp, brittle, desperate to pretend everything was normal. But beneath their feet, the ground swelled with pressure. The system was no longer straining. It was preparing. I went inside, then, leaving them to their ignorance. I knew what was coming, and I wanted to be well rested for the show. Because when the septic tank finally spoke, it wouldn't whisper, it would roar, and the sisters, they would be right in the middle of it. Sunday dawned bright and warm, the kind of day perfect for barbecues, lawn chairs, and idle conversations over glasses of wine. But as the sunlight poured over the neighborhood, it also revealed something far less pleasant. The sisters' backyard, once the picture of suburban the sour stench clung to the air like an invisible fog, drifting through hedges and across fences. I stepped outside with my coffee, inhaled once, and chuckled. It was worse than the night before, thick and unmistakable. Even the birds that usually gathered in the trees above their yard were gone, their branches empty, the silence eerie. By mid-morning, the sisters were at it again. They dragged out their folding tables, their coolers, their trays of finger foods. Today wasn't a party for kids or adults, it was a planning committee meeting. Another excuse to gather half the HOA on their property and remind everyone who was really in charge. They strutted around in matching pastel dresses, their hair perfectly styled, their faces painted with smug confidence. But their smiles wavered when they caught the odor. "Do you smell that again?" one muttered to the other. "It'll pass," the other replied firmly, as though her words alone could erase the stench. "It's just the weather stirring something up. We are not canceling over a smell." By noon, the yard was full. 30 people or more squeezed into folding chairs, sipping from plastic cups, while the sisters barked orders about neighborhood fences, lawn heights, and driveway cracks. Their voices were sharp, commanding, but the smell underneath every sentence was stronger, fouler, unavoidable. Guests whispered and coughed, waving their hands in front of their faces. Some excused themselves early, muttering vague excuses about errands. A few loyalists stayed, though their smiles were tight, their patience fraying. And then it happened. The first gurgle came loud, violent, like a giant drain unclogging deep underground. Heads turned, conversations stopped. The ground beneath the bouncy castle shuddered, rippling like a rug shaken from below. A few children screamed as the inflatable swayed unnaturally, it seems groaning. "What was that?" someone shouted. Before anyone could answer, a jet of dark liquid hissed out of the ground near the fence line. It wasn't water, it was thick, foul, and bubbling with gas. It sprayed upward in a disgusting fountain before splattering across the grass, leaving a blackened, steaming puddle. The yard erupted into chaos. Guests shrieked and scrambled from their chairs, knocking over plates and drinks. The sisters froze, their mouths open, their eyes wide with horror. The ground moaned again, louder, and then the real eruption began. With a sound like tearing metal, the soil split open in 3 places at once. Thick, bubbling sludge surged upward, spilling across the grass in waves. The stench hit everyone at once, a choking, nauseating odor that clung to clothes, hair, and skin. "Run!" someone screamed, grabbing their child and bolting toward the gate. People shoved and stumbled over each other, shoes slipping in the muck as they fought to escape. The bouncy castle collapsed completely, its fans shorting out with a sputter as sewage poured around its base. The bright inflatable, once a symbol of their pride, sank slowly into the brown tide. The sisters stumbled backward onto their deck, clutching each other in shock. One gagged violently, covering her mouth with her hand, while the other shrieked, "Do something, somebody do something." But there was nothing to do. The septic tank had been pushed past its limit. Years of quiet work beneath the ground had ended in one violent rebellion, triggered by their greed. The pump had given out, the valves blown. And now everything the system had hidden for so long was free. Guests continued to flee, gagging, screaming, their once pristine clothes splattered with filth. A man slipped and fell face first into the mess, scrambling on all fours as people pulled him up, their hands smeared. The air filled with the sound of retching, gagging, and panicked shouting from my porch. I leaned against the railing, watching the chaos unfold with a calm detachment. It was grotesque, yes, but it was also justice in its purest form. The sisters had stolen without thought, without care. Now they stood in the middle of their empire, drowning in the consequences they had created. One sister staggered toward the cord, yanking it from my outlet, as if that could undo what had already been unleashed. Sparks flew as the wet plug snapped free, but it was too late. The damage was done. The other clutched her hair, shrieking at the sky. This isn't fair. This can't be happening to us. But it was happening. To them, and only to them. By the time the last of their guests had escaped out the gate, their perfect backyard was unrecognizable. The grass was buried under a thick, bubbling sludge. The deck was splattered, the tables overturned and dripping. Their pastel dresses, once immaculate, were stained and clinging to their skin. Their perfume had been smothered by the stench of raw sewage. They stood alone now, gagging, trembling, their perfect world collapsing around them. The smell drifted across the neighborhood, but the spectacle remained confined to their yard. Neighbors peered out from windows and porches, whispering, pointing, some even laughing behind their hands. The queens of the HOA, the untouchable Karens, had been dethroned in the most humiliating way imaginable. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The septic tank had spoken louder than I ever could. As the sun began to set, the sisters sat slumped on their ruined deck, their faces pale, their eyes glassy. They didn't shout anymore, didn't complain, didn't command. They just sat there, broken, as the smell of their downfall lingered over everything they had built and me. I went inside, closed my door, and poured myself a drink. Justice had never been so foul or so sweet. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was still buzzing. Word traveled faster than wildfire when it came to HOA business, and the septic disaster had been nothing short of explosive gossip fuel. Everywhere you looked, neighbors stood in pairs on sidewalks or leaned over fences, whispering in tones that ranged from disgust to outright amusement. "Did you hear about the party?" Someone would start. "You mean the sewage flood?" came the inevitable reply, followed by muffled laughter or exaggerated gagging noises. It was the talk of the town, and for once the subject wasn't my lawn or anyone else's fence height. It was the sisters, the very women who had lorded their authority over everyone for years. They had become a spectacle, and the neighborhood wasn't going to let them forget it. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee as usual, when the cleanup crew finally arrived. 2 trucks rolled up, each hauling pumps, hoses, and men wearing rubber boots and masks. Even from a distance I could see their expressions crumple as they stepped into the sisters' yard. The stench was still unbearable, heavy in the warm air, clinging to everything like a curse. The sisters stood off to the side, arms crossed, their pastel dresses replaced with sweats and oversized sunglasses that did little to hide their humiliation. They barked orders at the cleanup crew, trying desperately to maintain control, but their voices carried no weight anymore. They sounded shrill, powerless, almost pitiful. One worker shook his head, muttering something I couldn't catch, and dragged a hose across the ruined lawn. Another fired up a pump, the motor growling as it sucked sludge into a massive tank. The process was slow, ugly, and loud. Every few minutes, a foul splatter echoed across the fence, making me smirk behind my coffee cup. By mid-afternoon, the worst of the mess was contained, but the damage was irreversible. The grass was dead, the soil poisoned. Their bouncy castle had been hauled away, dripping and deflated like some defeated monster. Even the wooden deck, once polished and perfect, was stained in ways no amount of scrubbing would erase. But the physical damage was nothing compared to what came next. That evening, the HOA held its regular monthly meeting. Normally, these gatherings were rigid affairs, dominated by the sisters' voices as they dictated rules and handed out warnings like royalty issuing decrees. But not this time. This time, the sisters walked in late, their shoulders stiff, their faces pale. The room went quiet as every eye turned to them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some trying to hide smirks, others openly grinning. The president of the HOA, a man they had bullied into silence countless times before, cleared his throat. "Before we begin tonight's agenda, I think it's important we address recent events." The sisters stiffened, their jaws tight. A woman in the back raised her hand, barely able to contain her laughter. "Are we going to discuss the biohazard that nearly flooded half the neighborhood?" The room erupted into chuckles. Even the usually stoic president cracked a smile. One of the sisters snapped, "That was an isolated incident, beyond our control." "Beyond your control," another neighbor shot back. "You plugged into someone else's property without permission and overloaded a septic system. That's not beyond your control, that's theft." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. For the first time, the sisters' authority cracked. They tried to argue, to deflect blame, but every sentence only made things worse. "Do you realize the smell drifted all the way down Maple Street?" Someone else chimed in. "My kids had nightmares after seeing what happened." Another shouted. The sisters faltered. Their words became tangled, their defenses weaker by the second. They looked around for support, but none came. The same neighbors who once feared their wrath now smelled blood in the water. Finally, the HOA president raised his hand for silence. "From this point forward," he said firmly, "you are suspended from your positions on the board until further Notice: a vote will be held next month to determine whether you remain at all. The room broke into applause. Real, genuine applause. Some people even whistled. The sisters sat frozen, their faces burning, unable to process what had just happened. They had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years, but in a single moment, their empire crumbled when the meeting adjourned. Neighbors crowded into the parking lot, buzzing with excitement. Did you see their faces? One man laughed, like someone took their crowns right off their heads. Good riddance, another muttered. Maybe now we can breathe without worrying about fines. The sisters slipped out quietly, their heads low. No longer the queens they once imagined themselves to be, back at home. I leaned against my porch railing once more, watching as they returned to their house. The cleanup trucks were gone, but the smell still lingered, faint but undeniable. The sisters stood in their ruined yard for a long time, staring at what used to be their pride and joy. I wondered what they were thinking. Maybe they were plotting revenge. Maybe they were still in denial. Or maybe, for the first time in their lives, they understood what it felt like to be powerless. The next few days only worsened their humiliation. Neighbors whispered openly when they walked by. Children pointed and laughed, mimicking gagging sounds. Someone even left a box of air fresheners on their porch with a note that said, "For emergencies." They tried to ignore it all, but the cracks were clear. They no longer patrolled the streets with clipboards. They no longer barked about paint, colors, or trash bins. Their voices, once loud and commanding, had been silenced by the very community they used to control, and I remained silent as always. I didn't need to boast, didn't need to point fingers. The truth was plain to everyone. The sisters had destroyed themselves. The septic tank had simply been the messenger. The days after the disaster blurred into one long humiliation for the Karen sisters. Their yard remained a scar on the neighborhood, brown patches of dead grass, a stained deck, and a stench that clung stubbornly no matter how many times they tried to cover it with sprays and candles. The image of their septic eruption had burned itself into everyone's memory, and no amount of denial could erase it. For years, they had held the neighborhood hostage with their rules, fines, and constant surveillance. But now, when they walked down the street, people didn't avoid them out of fear. They avoided them out of disgust, or worse. They laughed. By Wednesday morning, the sisters tried to regain some control. They put on their usual matching blazers, clipped their hair into tight buns, and marched door to door with clipboards in hand. They knocked on neighbors' doors, announcing surprise yard inspections as if nothing had changed. But the neighborhood had changed. One neighbor, a quiet man who rarely spoke, opened his door and said, "Don't you have more important things to clean up?" before shutting it in their faces. Another told them flatly, "You don't speak for us anymore. You've done enough." Children giggled behind curtains, pointing and whispering, "There go the poop sisters." By the third house, the sisters gave up, their shoulders slumped, their clipboards dangling uselessly at their sides. They had been dethroned. That Friday, a special HOA meeting was held, an emergency vote. For once, the community showed up in full force. Neighbors who had avoided these gatherings for years filled every chair, buzzing with energy. People who had been fined, threatened, or humiliated by the sisters were ready to cast their ballots. The sisters entered late, their eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but it didn't matter. Everyone knew them. Everyone remembered. The HOA president stood at the front, clearing his throat. "Tonight, we're voting on whether or not the current board members," his eyes flicked toward the sisters, "should remain in their positions." The vote wasn't close, not even slightly. Ballot after ballot was cast against them. When the final tally was read aloud, the sisters had been removed unanimously. Not a single person had voted to keep them in power. Gasps, cheers, and even applause filled the room. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't ruled by fear or fines, it was united. The sisters sat frozen, their hands clenched in their laps, their faces pale. Their kingdom had crumbled. They were no longer queens of the HOA. They weren't even board members. They were just neighbors, now neighbors everyone despised. They stormed out before the meeting ended, their heels clacking furiously against the floor. But their departure didn't silence the joy in the room. For once, the HOA felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. People laughed, shook hands, and even made plans to help one another with projects the sisters would have fined them for in the past. The next day, the sisters tried one last act of defiance. They set up lawn chairs in their ruined backyard, sipping wine loudly, pretending not to care. But the illusion was broken. Nobody came. Nobody bowed. They sat alone in their stinking kingdom, ignored by the very people they used to command. I watched from my porch, arms folded, feeling no need to gloat. I had never confronted them, never raised my voice, never fought back directly. And yet, somehow, I had won. Not because I had done anything extraordinary, but because I had done nothing at all. That their arrogance had been their undoing. They had reached across my fence, stolen what wasn't theirs, and in doing so awakened the one thing no one in their right mind would ever want to face: the septic system. The smell would fade eventually. The stains would weather, but the memory, that would linger forever. Whenever someone mentioned the HOA, they wouldn't think of power or rules. They'd think of fountains of sewage, screaming guests, and two sisters standing in their pastel dresses, humiliated before the entire neighborhood. The time summer ended, they had all but vanished from community life. No more clipboards, no more fines, no more smug speeches at HOA meetings. They stayed inside most days, curtains drawn, their yard still scarred and silent. Their empire was gone, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed. People painted their fences the colors they wanted. They decorated their lawns with gnomes and flamingos without fear. They parked trucks in their driveways, left toys in their yards, and laughed together at barbecues without worrying about fines. The sisters had ruled with fear, but once fear was gone, they had nothing. As I sat on my porch one evening sipping coffee while the sunset painted the sky orange, I thought about it all. The irony was too perfect. They had plugged into my outlet, thinking they were clever, but in truth, they had plugged into their own downfall. The septic tank had been patient, silent, hidden, just like me, and when it finally spoke, it ended them. That was the end of the Karen sisters' reign. Not with a vote, not with an argument, not with a confrontation, but with the raw, unstoppable truth that some systems, once pushed too far, will always fight back, and justice had never been so foul or so sweet.